Thank you, Jana. Was thinking of telling a couple jokes to liven this crew up a bit. Or maybe I'll save that to the social after these talks are done. I'm going to update Lake Whitefish and round whitefish on Lake Ontario. Find my Emmy. Like Brian, I'm having trouble. First, I want to talk about the distribution of these two species around Lake Ontario. I draw your attention to this map up here in the corner. This is, Brian just showed you a lot of lake trout data collected during the gill netting in New York waters. I'm going to, and it's done annually and is ongoing. We used to do a similar program in Ontario waters. The last time we did it was 2008. So it's not done anymore, but I combined all the years of the data for these two programs because it's kind of a lake-wide look to look at the distribution of these two species that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm not talking about abundance of them for a second, just their distribution around the lake. So my catches here from the gill nets are organized starting in the southwest at St. Catharines, but moving to the northwest, Ontario waters, moving still in the northwest and moving to the east across Lake Ontario and the northwest area, to the central part of the lake, and then the northeast, and then to the southeast and back across the New York side of Lake Ontario to the southwest again. Obviously very distinct distributions of the two species. Round whitefish found from Port Credit or Toronto in the west to Brighton in the east, only on the Ontario waters. There's none caught in New York waters. There are a few lake whitefish here at Toronto and Oshawa, but I want to suggest that the vast majority of the lake whitefish are found in northeastern Lake Ontario, from Brighton in the west to Cape Vincent in New York waters in the east. So quite a different distribution of the two species. A little bit of overlap here at the Brighton area where we do have some gill net information to look at. So there's just my schematic of the distribution of these two cold water benthic invertivore species, the round whitefish and the lake whitefish. Why are we interested in these two species? Well, for today's talk, we're interested in the case of the lake whitefish because there's an important commercial fishery for lake whitefish in northeastern Lake Ontario, arguably the most important species over the very long term in the commercial fishery. And we're interested in round whitefish because of their desire to spawn in the same place we like to build nuclear generating stations. There is no fishery for round whitefish, but we do have a competition here for space among these two parties. We do have specific fish community objectives for the species within the overall offshore benthic zone of Lake Ontario. Specifically for lake whitefish, we want to see an increase in lake whitefish abundance. That's because we want to see an increase because we've seen a very dramatic decrease from peak levels in the mid-1990s. So we're looking for increasing populations of lake whitefish. But the bottom line is, having evaluated this, we're not meeting this objective. As we'll see, I suggest there's kind of an uncertain future for these species that have been really impacted tremendously since with some of the ecosystem changes we saw in the 1990s. I'll say more about that in a second. And I'm really wondering if it's reasonable to suggest that we could have increased whitefish populations in the short term anyway, or medium term. In the 1990s, we saw huge ecosystem changes. Many of the changes probably induced by the invasion of dracaenid mussels. We had the loss of diaperia in the mid-1990s, which obviously the food of the lake whitefish certainly has had dramatic impacts on growth and survival of lake whitefish. But we've seen changes in in other components of the food web. Zooplankton prey has changed dramatically, and the survival of larval whitefish has declined, and some other effects. So the other exotics into the system, Cercopegus round goby. I see little larval round goby being fed upon by our juvenile lake whitefish. Really a change in diet there. So the big changes for the lake whitefish, the net result for today is there's a reduced carrying capacity for that species in Lake Ontario. So that's kind of what I want to leave you with the lake whitefish. The lake whitefish is well studied. The round whitefish is not as well studied at all, but is probably suffering from some of the same causes of impact as the lake whitefish. Let's look at the commercial fishery for lake whitefish, located in northeastern Lake Ontario. Long-term trends in the harvest in the commercial fishery, 150-year trends. Overall average of this whole time period, probably about 500,000 pounds annually. Probably the most important species over that whole time period in the fishery. Only a remnant, no fishery basically in the 1970s when we had really just a remnant stock of lake whitefish remaining. A resurgence in lake whitefish and in the fishery in the late 1980s and the 1990s. I highlight this with my little green box here because at this time we've got intensive management in place to restrict the amount of fishing. So there's quotas in place and gear restrictions and seasonality and stuff. So we argued at the peak levels of harvest here that we probably had a lake whitefish abundance that rivaled the levels of abundance in the early part of the 1900s. And then a decline in the harvest as the population crashed, and in more recent years, arguably a stabilization at a much reduced level. Looking at the more recent years so for the last, say, three decades, the harvest of whitefish in the black bars and the quota, that's harvest responding to the quota changes through time, but arguably for the last decade or so, maybe a stabilization in that fishery. Current 2014 harvest, 67,000 pounds. Looking at the age distribution of these lake whitefish in the 2014 commercial harvest for our two major spawning stocks of fish, the so-called lake stock and bay stocks in northeastern Lake Ontario. Broad range of ages. We still have some old, abundant, old year classes in the fishery that have really carried this fishery for the last few decades. We've got kind of almost missing year classes in the intermediate ages, and then a resumption of recruitment really in the last number of years. So we've got young fish now. But these young fish aren't anywhere near as abundant as these older year classes were when they were the age of these fish. Turning to some of our fishery independent surveys, we've got fairly intensive gill netting surveys in northeastern Lake Ontario and a couple of trawling locations. Those white circles are some locations for trawling that routinely capture young of the year lake whitefish. So we're going to look at a little bit of information from these surveys, gill netting and the trawling. In the trends in the gill netting series are here in this black line with the round circles. The commercial fish harvest is in the background in those gray bars. They kind of track each other fairly closely. The fishery was considered, the population was considered overexploited by the fishery back in the 1950s. Remnant population through the 1970s, recovery and decline, and arguably stabilization at a quite a bit lower level in recent years. So the commercial harvest and the assessment gill nets show quite similar results. Young of the Year at our bottom trawls to get a look at recruitment. No trawling early on. In 1972, we started trawling with a very little amount of reproduction at that time. Sporadic year classes in the mid-1980s, and then started to get some large year classes in the late 1980s, carrying through to the early 1990s. Loss of diapari around 1994, 1995. Some kind of missing year classes for about 5 years. A couple of decent year classes in the 2003, 2005, and some low and moderate year classes produced more recently. 2012 and 13 are present. That's the lake whitefish. Let's move to a little bit about round whitefish. We've got a gill net site at Brighton as part of the design of sampling this northeastern area. It's really just, obviously just on the edge of the range of the round whitefish, but I'm going to present a little bit of information from there. We've brought in a couple more gill net transects as of last year, so moving forward we should have some more information on round whitefish, particularly at our new Coburg site. But looking at Brighton and the catches through time in our gill nets at Brighton, an increase. As for lake whitefish, round whitefish increased in the late 1980s, peaked in the early 1990s, and then at Brighton they disappeared very quickly, and after the mid-2000s we've not seen any round whitefish. Obviously we're right on the edge of their distributional range, so their abundance declined, their range probably contracted more centrally out of this area where we're netting. Look at the size distribution of these round whitefish. In the 1990s we had a broad range of sizes in our gill nets, presumably including young fish, middle-aged fish, and old fish. But for those few fish that we caught in the 2000s, in the black bars here, those few fish, they are only big, large, old round whitefish. So there's likely a recruitment issue with the round whitefish as for the lake whitefish. Spawning assessment for round whitefish. There's a nice piece of work done, 1976 to 1981, a 5-year period, and a nice report summarizing some spawning assessment work in front of the nuclear generating stations that were either online in the case of Pickering at the time, or being planned, about to be built at Darlington. So there was some work done across this area over a 5-year period, and the primary findings of the work was that round whitefish spawn here during the first 2 weeks of December. Most of the spawning occurs in 5 to 10 meters water depth. Most of the fish at that time in the spawning population were aged 2 to 8 years, and spawning areas seem to be located in association with headland or point areas along this north shore. We had the opportunity to go out this past December 2014 and revisit some of these locations. Pickering, it's the nuclear generating station there, and there is at Darlington, and we chose a third site that would span or increase our distributional coverage of looking at these round whitefish, a so-called Peter Rock site. We just went out really to have a look and see what's going on, but we collected tissues from 50. Our goal was to collect tissue samples from 50 fish at each site to answer a genetic question. Are we dealing with one or many genetic populations, or what is the genetic diversity of these fish along their spawning distributional range? This is a collaborative effort with Ontario Power Generation. Working out on Lake Ontario in this area, here's Peter Rock here and shoaling up here in the background. In the first couple weeks of December is a lot of fun. and I highly recommend it. We did catch our round whitefish. We caught 172 round whitefish at spawning time, 49 at Pickering, 93 at Darlington, 30 at Peter Rock. Not too much effort required, 5 gill net sets to catch 93 at Darlington, but at Peter Rock it took us 40. It took us a lot more effort to catch some fish at Peter Rock to get up to a decent sample size. Obviously the density there is lower. We haven't done the genetic work yet on these fish. That'll be done this year, and hopefully report on that coming up next year. And finally, last slide, we did get to age the fish, the 172 fish that we caught this past December. And a little bit of, I wasn't surprised to see the very old fish from year classes back in the early 1990s, and I wasn't surprised to see some more or less missing year classes, very similar to lake whitefish. I was a bit surprised to see the recruitment of some young fish, which obviously is a good positive sign. I think like the lake whitefish, maybe I'll throw up the distributions of our age distributions of our lake whitefish, a couple of big spawning stocks, and our round whitefish in completely different area of the lake, but there's some definite similarities in age distribution. But I'm encouraged by these appearance of these young year classes most recently. But I don't think they're going to turn out to be near as abundant as those year classes of 20-some years ago. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.